Hi, welcome back to Fishhead. I'm Duncan, and today we're talking about rigging poppers and stick baits. So it's not too much of a challenge, but when you start out, it can be a little bit daunting because there's so many different hook styles, so many different recommendations for what people suggest, and all the different shapes of lures that go along with that. So there's a few basic principles that I tend to work with for setting up my hooks on the lures. And yeah, I'm going to take you through them today. First up, we have poppers. I have a few different poppers here, all different shapes and sizes. The first thing I really look for is what kind of weights are going to balance on the lures. So there's a couple of ways you can figure that out. One is to look for manufacturers' recommendations. The second one is, well, on our website, we try and put some recommendations for hook sizing for each of our lures. So that gives you plenty of options there. And then from that point, so in this case, we have a pair of 7.0 decoy hooks, which match up really nicely with this FCL Labo lure. Starting out with trebles. Trebles are the simplest way to go about things. When I rig up the lure, usually from trip to trip, I'm leaving my split rings on the hooks because the hooks get reused quite a lot. I find easiest way to know which hooks are your used ones and which ones are fresh ones that haven't been out of the box is to leave the split rings on there. Also, it means you don't keep stretching your split rings all the time, taking them on and off hooks. Normally the biggest challenge for a split ring is getting on and off the wire of the hook without getting stretched too much. So if you can minimize the number of times that you swap split rings to hooks, it definitely improves the longevity of the split rings. So to put that on the lure, so we push the split ring open with a split ring plier and slide it on. I always try not to overstretch the split ring. So every time you take it on and off a lure, it does stretch the split ring a little bit. So if possible, we just slide that split ring on. So we're doing the absolute minimum of opening on the split ring there. So now it can sit and spin freely. I don't leave the hooks on the lures for extended periods of time. So if I go away on a trip, I will leave obviously I'll leave hooks rigged all the way through the trip, but when I come home, I always strip the hooks and rings off. That's because most lures run a stainless wire through the center of the lure, and that tends to turn hook points into anodes and they rust over time. So yeah, easier to store hooks away from lures, also makes it much easier for packing them away. So again, we just snap that on there with the minimum amount of stretching that we can get away with and slide that on. Okay, so there's our popper ready to go. You may be wondering, well, how do I know that that is the correct way to have it rigged? First thing you would do is go and throw it in the water and see how it sits. So typically with a popper, it's going to want to sit with the cup sitting just on the surface or just above the surface. You get some lures that want to sit nice and parallel to the surface and others that tend to sit tail down. So every lure is a little bit different, but in this case, we're going to look for the water level being there and the cup being just outside of the surface. With the weights that are there, this for me has been a good all-rounder option. But if you are fishing on a particularly rough day, you may find you want to use heavier hooks to hold the lure down against the water surface a bit more. And when you're pulling into really choppy waves, having the lure barely above the surface will enable you to punch the popper through the backs of the waves. So the rougher it is, the heavier the hooks. Likewise, if you try and use a really heavily hook-weighted popper on glass calm smooth conditions where the water is sitting right up against the edge of the cup, when you go to rip it, you often won't get much of a bloop because the cup just goes underwater, so you don't get much of a splash. So on those glass calm days, you may need to make things just a little bit lighter to push the cup further up out of the water. So after you've got your basic rigging set up with trebles, then we start to look at other options. So trebles tend to make a lure nice and stable in the water. They act like little parachutes on the lure, which slows down its action. Sometimes that's a great thing. You want the lure to stick to the water well, track nicely, be really predictable. But other times you may want the lure to be a bit more lively and get more action out of it. So at that point, we'll often drop off the tail treble hook. I'll just pop that one back off, and we will swap it out for a single hook. Okay, so we've got a single hook. In this case, it is the 11.0 BKK Diablo. Makes a nice balance for the rear there, and we've got a number 10 decoy split ring. The size of the split rings, people might look at it and go, oh, that's a giant size split ring for the hook. But again, it's all about getting a split ring which will go over the thinnest part of the eyelet on the hook the best. And yeah, for this kind of GT fishing, you want, you've got really thick hooks, so you typically need rather large rings to go with it. A lot of hooks these days have a little flattened edge somewhere on the hook where it narrows down, makes it easier to put the split ring on. And in this case, it is down the bottom. So I just squeeze that and then keep squeezing until it goes pop onto there. There it goes. Then relax, and then we just slide it on. Right, so now we have our popper with a single and a treble. The single on the tail there gives less drag at the back end, so the lure is now going to be a little bit more active in the water. When you pull it with a long stroke through the water, the tail is more likely to wiggle, so it gets a little bit more action out of it. Also, it takes a couple of grams off, so it will sit a little bit higher in the water and make it easier to do more active actions. But if you get into really choppy stuff and the lure starts cartwheeling out of the water all the time, then you might want to drop back to the treble hook to hold it, stick those parachutes back on the tail and hold the lure down in the water. Going from there, quite a few people like running single hooks front and rear. So we can continue with this and swap out to the single on the front as well. There are a couple of reasons for going for singles all round. One is having only 2 hook points does less potential damage to the fish when you're going to release it. It's a pretty common thing in places where there are, when you're really remote, because the last thing you want when you're in a remote place is a hook stuck in the angler. So single barbless hooks make a lot of sense in those more remote places, but they have their pluses and minuses. For one, obviously you've gone from having 6 hook points down to 2. So you want to be confident that the fish are taking the lures really well. I've been on trips where some days the fish will just swallow every lure they hit. And it wouldn't matter if you're using trebles or singles, they're going to hook up really well every time. But on the other hand, I've been on trips where all of the fish, like the big GTs, they swim up, they come up to the side of the lure and they whack it with the side of their head. And partly they're trying to bite it, other times it looks like they're just trying to hit it with their sharp gill rakers because they're being super aggressive but not necessarily hungry. And when you've just got the 2 single hooks, on those days, sometimes you miss a whole lot of hookups because the fish comes up, hits the lure from the side, lure rolls over, and the single hook lays flat against the side of the lure. So it doesn't really do you much in terms of getting the hookups there. Whereas with a treble, when the treble sits on there, there's always a hook pointing out somewhere to catch a fish. As the lure rolls over, treble hook sticks out. So gives you that extra option for hooking the fish. However, when it comes to hooking a really big fish, there's nothing beats a good strong single stuck in the jaw of the fish. There's less leverage for the fish to try and twist and get the hooks out. So if you're looking at catching everything that swims, I always tend more towards treble hooks. If you are solely going to try and catch the biggest fish ever, you're trying to break your records, then I start to think more about single hooks. Okay, so one other aspect to consider with single hooks on lures definitely happens when you use skinnier lures. Not such a big deal when you have a really big, fat, chunky popper, but it's definitely a consideration with these slimmer lures. And that goes for stick baits or poppers. And that's the problem where the single hook rolls over the back of the lure and pins into the lure like that. If you use short assists, it causes even more problems. So it's really annoying if every third cast, your lure comes back like that. When it sticks in there, obviously the lure doesn't swim properly and you're not going to get any bites. And any bites you do get aren't going to hook up. So sometimes, yeah, the single hooks just don't work as well with some poppers. And that goes for stick baits as well, but we'll talk about stick baits in a moment. And yeah, so my general hookup setup for a long slim popper like this is always going to be a treble on the belly, and then I will swap between singles and trebles on the tail. If we move on to a shorter, fatter, chunkier popper, so we've got the fish head hippo popper. This has got a much shorter, broader body. Again, we've got some big heavy trebles to go on it. In this case, the lure, rather than having wire through it, has a big solid plate. And thing to notice is that the plate is thicker across than it is in profile, whatever the word is. So when you're putting the split ring on there, it needs to slide on in that way. So it slides on really easily that way. It doesn't go on very easily going vertically on. Okay, and I've probably done that. I don't know if there is a right or a wrong way. Typically, I like to have my hook sitting like that. I don't know if it works better. Certainly makes me feel better because it looks nice. This one, I've done it other way around and the hook point is facing down. So I'm sure someone's got a theory that that means the hook points are more exposed there, but it's up to you. Same goes for tail hooks. Some people like to have the tail hook one way or the other way. I've heard different explanations as to why one works better than the other. I've tended to always have the two hook points down just because, well, I guess probably I've always done that way, so I've kept it that way. But the other reason would be that there's a bit more weight on the bottom side, which helps to stabilise the lure. I guess you could run it the other way around deliberately to try and destabilise the lure and have a bit more wobble in it. Okay, so we've got a short fat popper now. Some of the things to look for on short fat poppers are the hook doesn't go past the cup. So if you were to swap that out for a longer single hook or a really giant sized treble hook, you want to make sure the hook does not catch on the cup because that is going to be really annoying. A short lure like this, the hooks will get close, but they're not going to mesh up. So that's another good consideration. But one of the advantages of these shorter, fatter poppers is that there's a lot of hooks per centimetre of lure. So the hookup rates tend to be pretty good, although they have different drawbacks and positives in general. You can see on this lure also we've got some scratches there. Those scratches occur because as soon as you hook a fish, the hook gets dragged back and forth across the body of the lure. So you always get these nice big scratch marks across your lures. hooks that have slightly curved in points tend to do it less. So curved in points are quite popular for big GT lures, for one reason being that less likely when a fish bites it to just push a hook point straight into the body of the lure, but also it does reduce that hook rash a little bit on your lures, if that bothers you. Some people prefer straight points because they believe it pins the fish more effectively. Other people will say that curved points hold on to the fish a little better, so less likely to drop a hook up. I mean, yeah, I don't really have a strong opinion either way. I've used both styles of hooks and found them both to work pretty well. But yeah, if you find one that works best for you, then go for it. Okay, similarly with this lure, we can swap it out for a single on the tail. We can go full singles. I know in the case of this particular lure, it's really nice and stable, has a good wobble through the water with the two trebles. When I put a single on the tail, gets more lively action. With two singles, I find the lure tends to want to porpoise and jump out of the water a bit much. So for me, this lure just happens to work best with the two trebles or the treble and the single. But again, that's personal preference. Everyone has their own opinion on what swims best and what looks best. But by all means, just throw some hooks on your lure, go toss it in the water, do different kinds of actions, see what it does, see what works best for you. Stick baits. Floating stick baits are definitely one of the, I guess, out of selecting hooks and things, the action of floating stick baits is most influenced by the hook setup. So floating sticks, you've got ones that sit with their nose out of the water, and you have ones that tend to want to sit more parallel with the water. The smooth nose on the front, to get them to swim, you need your leader to drop down into the water so that when you pull the line, the nose dips and they swim beneath the surface, assuming it's not a skipping lure designed to bounce across the top. But most stick baits are that thing where they sit above the water and they're designed to dip and swim below the water. So the hook setup has a big influence on how that lure is going to swim. And like the poppers, it's exactly the same concept, but it's just that they can be a little bit more twitchy. So on this case, we've got a pair of trebles on here. I would say a lot of Japanese stick baits over the years have been designed to swim with the weight of treble hooks on them. So when people start playing around with singles, or they start off with single hooks from the get-go, they throw their fancy Japanese stick bait in the water and it tends to want to just leap out and porpoise and bounce across the surface, and it's pretty underwhelming action. The reason often is that the hooks just aren't balanced right. You can make even, I guess, the worst stick bait can get a decent action as long as you have the right hook set up to balance it. On this Liber Tango stick bait, I've adjusted the hook slightly, so I've gone for a bit of an oversized hook at the tail, kept the original hook on the front. Now it's an interesting exercise to play around with these hooks because normally you would run the same size hooks front and rear, but definitely if you're in for a bit of experimenting, doing things like putting a bigger hook on the tail will make, potentially in rougher conditions, will make the tail sit, well, anytime, it'll make the lure sit more vertical in the water. So if you want to get a more aggressive slapping action on the water, so you're pulling a big bubble trail, having a bit more weight at the tail and a little bit less at the front will make that lure stand up more. You only run into issues when you overdo it so much that the lure starts sinking below the surface. Then it's obviously not so great. But you could do that, set that weight down the back there, make the lure sit very vertical, and then rip it more like a popper. And that face, the flat face on the front of the stick bait, pulls hard into the water and makes a big bubble trail. So great way to experiment. You could go the other way, throw the heavy hook on the front and keep the regular hook on the back and make it sit more horizontal in the water. That might get you a really nice snaky action where it sits just below the surface and swims along really nicely. Or it might just want to porpoise and not go below the surface at all because the little lip under there on the lure makes it want to just skim across the surface with the weight to the front. Likewise, if you change the balance of the hooks, you will also change the way it casts. So on a really windy day, going full single hooks creates less drag, so the lure flies through the air much better. It's quite a significant difference when you put a couple of heavy singles on a regular stick bait. If you're out there casting in 20 knots of wind, the lure just flies so much better with singles. So that's something that you can play around with as well. Another thing which is becoming very popular is running assist hooks on the stick baits. So I think a lot of people found initially, people started going from trebles to singles on their stick baits, found that the lures were quite challenging to balance and to get them to maintain the good swimming action. And then people went, well, maybe we can put assist hooks that you would have previously used for jigging onto the lures. In this case, we've got some Shout double Kadakos on a very short assist cord. They create more drag in the water. So the lure starts to swim with single hooks, but behave more like it has a treble hook hanging off it. For two, loose hooks are more likely to swing around and catch the fish when it grabs. And also when the fish is hooked, there's a lot more ability to move and wiggle around, so the fish is less likely to throw the hook. If you've got a little set of mini kitchen scales at home, you can weigh, when you get a hook set up that you like, you can throw those hooks onto the scales, figure out how many grams it is, and then that gives you a good starting point for moving to all different other kinds of hooks. So in the case of this, it tells you on there that each hook setup is 3.7 grams. So it's a handy guide. Okay, so now we have the little assists, front and rear. So we've got the goal of having more hook points, having hooks that can flail around a bit more and hook fish more easily. We've still got single hooks, so when the hook goes in, it's just a nice single. There aren't extra prongs there to help the fish kind of lever it out of its mouth. It casts a little better because those, when it's casting, they'll lay flat against the body. It won't cause any problems like the trebles in strong breezes. It won't catch as much, so it'll fly a bit cleaner and straighter. And when it swims, the hanging hooks drag a bit more, so it behaves a bit more like it was originally intended with the trebles on there. So you might say this is the perfect setup. Yes, maybe, is the simple answer. I don't think they still hook up quite as often as a treble hook, but it is a really good sort of halfway point between regular singles and trebles. Also, a lot of the commercially made assists, they're made on regular assist cord, which is nice and soft. It's strong in terms of pulling power, but it's not mackerel and wahoo teeth proof. So if you go to a lot of tropical places where everything has teeth, these assists can wear down very fast, or in some cases they can be snipped right off if they're not thick enough. A lot of people starting to make their own out of Kevlar assist, which is much, much stronger and much more tooth resistant. So if you want to have a crack at this and you're doing a lot of tropical fishing, maybe think about making some of your own. We have the single short assists as well. So I'll show that one. One of the reasons to go to the single short assist would be you can use a super heavy gauge hook. So if we were chasing really big tuners on these 180mm lures, where we're going to have to pull really hard, use heavy lines, and yeah, so we're basically using small lures to catch really big fish. That is an opportunity, that short assist hook, going with an ultra heavy gauge hook. You still get the balance you want without overweighting it, and yeah, that's a good way to go as well. Thanks for watching. There's probably some things I haven't covered here, so feel free to reach out to us and remind us of all the things we forgot to talk about, and we will cover it in a future video. Thanks very much.